Hello viewers, thank you for joining me. It only feels right to share right off the bat that I was drawn to this show while looking for something similar to Kiesniver, a show that I loved about a group of kids brought together and connected so that when one was hurt, either physically or emotionally, they all felt it. A love that, unfortunately, didn't seem to be shared by too many people. So I know it's a little inevitable that while I'm analyzing this anime, I'll be making some comparisons to that one, but I did try to look at this show with fresh eyes and judge it like any other. Our story starts with Yamaboshi Academy, a school where every student is required to join a club. This is how our 5 main characters were brought together, despite not having much in common. There's Taichi, who acts as our narrator most of the time. He cites professional wrestling as his one real passion, but there wasn't a club for it. On the other hand, there's Iori, who's passionate about everything, and ended up picking her club at random when she couldn't decide. Aoki's backstory is kind of along those same lines. He's very laid back and carefree and doesn't really have any particular hobbies that would stick out when choosing a club, so it's pretty safe to say he only ended up with this group so he could be closer to his crush, Yui, a martial artist whose first choice of club closed down. And last is Himeko, who originally joined the computer club but immediately got into a fight with the club president, and is implied anyway to have been kicked out. These 5 make up the Student Cultural Society, a very loosely supervised group who puts together the school newspaper. On a quick side note, before we move forward, whenever there's a show with a lot of main characters, I tend to do some research early on so I can learn their names, so I got used to referring to her as Himeko before it became apparent that everyone around her calls her Inaba. Some of it is cultural, I know, like Taichi refers to all the girls using their surnames, but in this little group, Himeko is the only one they never really start calling by her first name, so I gravitated towards the kids' first names in general. Hopefully that should clear up any confusion with anyone who's already familiar with the show. Things really kick off when Yui and Aoki come in one day and tell the others that they switched bodies for a while the previous night. The other 3 aren't really sure what to make of this, whether or not to treat it as a joke, when Taichi and Iori suddenly switch. And I have to say, Kokoro Connect got off to a really good start. This first episode is the sort of thing I'd describe as simple but brilliant. It's spent almost entirely in the club room, but the body swapping is an excellent, subtle way of introducing us to the characters. Like, we barely know these kids at this point, but it's all too clear how out of place Iori's high-energy reactions and mannerisms look coming from Taichi, who's usually very polite and reserved. It felt like a very fun, very clever introduction, and the scenes where it really sinks in that this crazy, unexplainable thing is actually happening were genuinely eerie. It felt real. Over the next few days, these switches keep happening amongst the 5 at random until one day their club advisor shows up, and something's not quite right about him. The being who's taken over their teacher introduces himself as Heartseed and basically tells them that they're just entertainment for him and these switches will keep happening at random, presumably until he grows bored of them. He really doesn't tell them anything they hadn't already figured out themselves, and then he disappears again. Unfortunately, Heartseed is where this series starts to go downhill, but I'll get to that later. I loved this setup. I'm all about cheesy, heartwarming friendship stories, particularly ones where something forces a group of casual friends to suddenly get real close real fast, and it was a lot of fun to watch these 5 try and navigate the body swapping while slowly learning more about each other, and thus becoming more interesting characters in the process. I really don't plan for this review to be too spoiler-heavy, but I do want to discuss each of the characters at least a little, because a lot of things are set up very early on. Honestly, both of the boys felt a little bland sometimes compared to how much character development each of the girls got, but I liked Taichi well enough as our narrator. He's the kind of person who always puts others first, and it starts an interesting conversation about whether that level of selflessness can be considered selfish too, about why he's really going to such lengths to help others. Aoki got the least development of anyone, but he's a very simple guy. He does get one really good moment later on in the series where he talks about why it seems like he doesn't take anything seriously, which isn't really a huge spoiler or anything. Basically, there was this girl in one of his classes who spent her whole life studying and preparing for the future, only to be killed in a car accident and have all her hard work go to waste. This really left an impact on him and motivated him to live every day to the fullest and not worry too much about the future. I guess I just wanted to give Aoki the spotlight for a little while because that one story plus his crush on Yui is literally the extent of his character. But the three girls were definitely the more interesting characters in this series, and if there are any important spoilers, you'll see them here. It feels a little like I'm starting at the end, but Himeko was the character I related to the most. She doesn't have Iori's serious family problems or Yui's traumatic past, but her pride made her very relatable to me. It takes a long time before she's able to show weakness or any sort of vulnerability to her friends. Early on, once she's aware of what some of her friends are dealing with, she feels like she doesn't deserve to show weakness over her more ordinary problems. Trust doesn't come easily to Himeko, and if one of them was going to be a little ordinary, I think it was a good problem to showcase. I think Iori's the most interesting character. She's a little eccentric and constantly cheerful, but a love triangle between Iori, Taichi, and Himeko was already brewing at this point, so we've seen a deeper, more serious side to her too. And Taichi has seen that the body switching has been particularly troubling for her. She made a really interesting point in episode 2 about how soul, mind, and personality may actually determine who a person is, but physical appearance is the foundation of identity, and if their physical bodies are losing their significance, is it changing who they really are? Following this up with comments like, "I barely had a grip on my personality as it was." Finally, she tells Taichi that her parents are divorced, and her mother's been remarried no less than 5 times. Some of the early husbands were openly abusive, and she learned to play a part to keep them happy. Soon it started spreading to her interactions with everyone. She would read the room and be whoever they wanted her to be. Her last stepdad was actually pretty decent and told her on his deathbed that he wanted her to start living her own life. Only she's started to realize that she doesn't really know who she is anymore. It was a really memorable sentiment, and I know it sounds like a huge spoiler, and in a way it is, but it's also only half the story. Iori trying to find balance between her sense of self versus who everyone thinks she should be is a conflict that isn't resolved until the very last episode. And lastly, we've got Yui, my personal favorite character, though the anime was almost over by the time she'd really claimed that role. When the series starts out, she just comes across as being very sweet and quiet. She has a few outbursts regarding Aoki's crush on her, which she's not exactly thrilled about, but not in an overly violent way like you typically see in anime. But through the body swapping, her friends start noticing a physical reaction they get from being around their male classmates and teachers when they're in Yui's body. They'll start shaking or sweating and their heart will start pounding. At last, Taichi questions her about this. You'll notice a pattern here. Taichi kind of becomes everyone's personal therapist, and she reveals to him that she was sexually assaulted when she was in middle school. I think one of the reasons Yui's story really connected with me is because it's just as much about pride as Himeko's. I mentioned early on that she was a martial artist, and it wasn't just a casual hobby. She was winning karate tournaments left and right, so she was really shaken by how easily she was overpowered. She managed to get away, but it left her with a phobia of men in general, and her confidence really took a hit. She gave up karate altogether and is really just a shadow of the person she used to be at the start of the series. She doesn't get the spotlight a ton of the time, but her growth throughout the series was really moving to me. Be it the way her friends tried to help her, or the way Aoki handled his crush once he found out and realized he may have been overstepping some boundaries, or the way she finally put her foot down at the end and started taking back her life. It really showed an awareness that this sort of trauma can't be cured by a single reassuring conversation. I recently reviewed Kiss Him, Not Me, and that show also had an episode that focused on sexual assault. A single episode, mind you, not a whole storyline like this. I praised that show for not just brushing it off, when too often in anime, scenarios like that one are played off as a joke or like they're supposed to be romantic. And I'm not taking that back, but I do want to stress that the way it was handled here was just on a whole other level. Yui's story is the type that encourages other people to get help. And yes, it's a pretty big spoiler, but honestly, given the subject material, I think I would feel worse sending anyone into it completely blind. It honestly surprised me sometimes that this show was only rated PG-13. It wasn't afraid to get dark at times. So anyway, these 5 came together to be a likable, interesting cast of main characters. They each had their place in the group, and I can understand why the creator would want to play with them, which brings us back to Heartseed, who is honestly the worst thing about this show. The body swapping actually comes to a head in episode 5. Heartseed puts them through a test that I won't spoil, and then things quiet down for a while, until suddenly, seemingly out of nowhere, they start losing their impulse control for brief periods of time. Heartseed reappears to explain his newest game, that he's unleashing their deepest desires, leaving them with a whole new set of challenges. In particular, after his last test, they're afraid of what he might do if they don't play his game, which causes a lot of tension when Yui starts hiding out in her room. But by this point, excluding some of the furthered character development, I was already starting to lose patience with this show. Heartseed is a really weak plot device, and I might as well come right out and say it, that's all he is. After the unleashed desires, it's periods of de-aging. After the de-aging, they start randomly experiencing each other's thoughts and emotions. And it's not that these ideas aren't interesting, but we're never given any more of an explanation for what Heartseed is and why he's doing this than, you guys are my entertainment. The de-aging is actually blamed on some other mysterious being, and I have no idea why they bothered, because neither of them have any personality. It just feels lazy. Like the creator had all these great characters they wanted to play with, but didn't have a story to tell with them, and so Heartseed was plopped down in the middle of it all to manipulate them into just the right positions so they would interact in ways that allowed us to learn more about them. It's hard to believe I went this long without referencing Kiznaiver in some way, but this was where I really felt it. And perhaps the worst part of all this is that I critiqued that plot for being a little cliché and overly simple, but at least Kiznaiver had a motivation for its antagonists, and a reason for the crazy things happening to the kids. Almost literally anything would have been better than the blatant creator manipulation that Kokoro Connect gave us. I'm kind of torn, which I guess represents my experience with this anime accurately at least. The whole thing, or at least from episode 6 onwards, was this struggle between characters that I loved and a plot that I hated. I think whether or not you'll enjoy this show really depends on what you're looking to get out of it. The heartfelt friendship story is really good, but the mystical sort of plotline is subpar at best, hindered by the way they don't even attempt a proper explanation. Personally, I wanted both. I was hoping it would be the kind of character story I was looking for, but was drawn in by the supernatural happenings going on around them. If you are thinking of looking into it, there is one other thing I should mention. I mentioned in my last review that something had delayed this one. Officially speaking, Kokoro Connect is a 13-episode series, but when I reached the end it really didn't feel complete, so I started looking into the OVA episodes and quickly found that they're not really OVAs in the way that I tend to think of them, as unrelated mini-adventure episodes. They are a direct continuation of the story, and wrap up both the love triangle and Iori's personal struggles. So basically, just be warned that the last 4 episodes of the series were only ever released on DVD, but I didn't have too much trouble tracking them down. Thank you for watching.